Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring psychedelics and philosophy. With me is philosopher Pierre Grimes, who is the author of Philosophical Midwifery, as well as The Portable Pierre and A Dialogue in Heaven Between Socrates and Jesus. Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you.
You've been practicing philosophy a long time. As I recall, your studies of ancient Greek philosophy began back in the 1950s.
That's correct. Right after work, yes. Mm-hmm. Actually, from 1948.
From 1948, shortly after you got out of the service.
That's true.
Like Socrates, you were a soldier.
That's true. In the infantry.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
In the Second World War.
Yeah. Africa, Italy, France, Germany, Austria, two invasions.
And when you got out of the service, you entered into the profession of philosophy. And at that time, you encountered one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Alan Watts.
That's true. Mm-hmm. Yes. I was very fortunate in meeting a group of them at the graduate school. The University of the Pacific was called the American Academy of Asian Studies. We had Lama Tata from Tibet, a Japanese monk that became a Tibetan philosopher. Jiming Shen, a Taoist, a native Taoist in a family of Taoists. Alan Watts, Haridas Chaudhry, yes. It was a great period of time.
Yeah. So it was in this milieu where you're studying both ancient Greek philosophy and a variety of Asian philosophies with some of world-class teachers that you first encountered psychedelics.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And Alan Watts, of course, is famous, maybe even notorious for his use of intoxicants, including psychedelics.
Yes, actually, at one time with Alan, he called me up and he said, Pierre, I just gave a broadcast on KPFK and I kind of got along with it and I forgot what I said. Would you mind seeing if you can find someone who made notes or a recording of it? Because I made certain points about psychedelics and I said they weren't and didn't have any place in philosophy.
Oh.
So early in his life, he took that position. Mm-hmm. Then when LSD became popular, he did experiment in it, and that changed everything, as it did for the whole San Francisco area, and subsequently America.
For the San Francisco Bay Area, for the Boston area, where you had Timothy Leary, a Harvard professor,
right,
and Houston Smith, a professor of
right,
philosophy, engaging in psychedelic use.
That's right. I was in that whole group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But the use of altered states of consciousness in philosophy itself, I think, goes back to Plato at least.
Yes. The Eleusinian Mysteries, in fact, Gordon Watson and his colleagues did a book on that called The Road to Eleusinius, in which they described the Eleusinian Mysteries and point out the fact that the substance used was a derivative of ergot, which we now know is similar to the LSD in composition.
And the point of it, of course, the Eleusinian Mysteries were secret. You were not to reveal them except on penalty of death.
Yes, yes.
But what I've gleaned from my study is that the point of it was, let me put it this way. People who came out of the mystery said they lost all fear of death.
That's right.
And the implication is that they had a way of inducing what we might call today a near-death experience or an altered state of consciousness where people perhaps entered into the Bardo plains or became acquainted in their consciousness with the idea of death in such a deep way that they lost their fear.
Yes, and that's philosophy, because that's one of Plato's dialogues. Overcoming the fear of death is the Phaedo, by having an experience of an out-of-body experience that then gives the participant an insight and experience of the higher realms of consciousness called the nature of ultimate reality.
And there's good reason to believe that when Plato refers to out-of-body experiences, he means it quite literally.
Oh, yes. Yes, it's a quote right out of Plato. That's at 69 is the Stephanus number, where he talks about, he says, we have often talked about the separation of the soul from the body and how you have to collect the soul from all parts of the body and then separate it and then unify it once it is separated so you can then experience the nature of ultimate reality. Yes.
So the ancient Greeks and certainly in the Platonic world itself were practicing this as a discipline.
Yes, yes. And his magnificent dialogue, the Symposium, is a description of that very state. And he calls it pure beauty or an experience of ultimate reality. He also calls it truth, by the way.
Because most scholars today would treat that as a metaphor, not as an actual spiritual discipline, augmented by intoxicants or psychedelics of some sort.
Well, you have to put those people aside.
And if we were to look at the ancient philosophers who created the Vedas in India, the first Vedantic philosophers, there's quite a bit of literature regarding the use of a mysterious substance they called soma.
Yes, yes, the magic mushroom. Yeah, Amanita domesticaria. Yes, that's true. And therefore it has a long distinguished record, and it has transformed men into becoming more than themselves and becoming enlightened. And that's the goal of philosophy. Plato argues in the Republic that state is the primary state men must experience, because in that experience of ultimate reality, they're able to gain from it an inference that the very nature of justice is an integral part of that magnificent experience of divine luminosity, and therefore it justifies the idea that justice is not an arbitrary experience, but is inherent in that very highest experience.
Now, the Platonic dialogues, as I understand them, also discuss banquets in which wine was used liberally. And, I get the impression that is distinguished from the kind of depth exploration associated with the Eleusinian mysteries.
Yes. Socrates was said to have been able, as in the Symposium, drink everyone under the table and still walk away indifferent to the alcohol he consumed and spend the rest of his day as he usually did. And indeed, some people who have distinguished themselves in mysticism find that's true for themselves as well. They can consume any number of things, still be themselves and work through it.
So you got to know Alan Watts quite well.
Yes.
And you observed him go through this transition from being against psychedelics as a philosophical tool to being in favor.
Right.
Can you tell me more about that process for him?
Well, there are several friends of mine that we were involved in peyote. And we were using peyote as well as for meditation, and we were then involved in psychedelic experiences. And we kept it hidden, because at that time you could get peyote buttons from Texas and El Paso, a whole shoebox full of them for $5. And therefore nobody knew anything about it, well, or very little about it, except for Huxley. And therefore we were exploring it on the quiet. Then LSD came, and that changed everything. Therefore, Alan then had to re-examine everything he had been thinking about and reconstructed his work along this line that is now possible to enter into it through this medium.
And was Huxley part of your group as well?
No, Huxley was apart from it. his primary work, of course, was known.
Yeah. I mean, Aldous Huxley, the great novelist, also wrote a book called The Doors of Perception.
Right, that was our handbook.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In which basically he's suggesting that psychedelic drugs have a way of sort of blowing through the crust of socialization and conditioning so that you can see things directly.
That's right, and that's what it did, and that's what it does. Under certain conditions, by the way, because I was present helping some people going through the experience, and in one case, a woman said, after 20 minutes, I want out. I don't want to go any further, and she panicked. So I would say it's for some people willing to take the risk, but ideally they should have the setting proper and have things arranged so that it can be more beneficial and to reduce the fear.
Yeah. Timothy Leary popularized the phrase set and setting.
That's right.
Being crucial. In other words, the expectations of the people going into the experience and the environment, the support that they get from the environment during the experience make a huge difference.
Oh, yes, decidedly.
Because many people, of course, use psychedelic drugs for recreational purposes, not philosophical purposes.
That's for entertainment, it's called, yes. I've never done that.
Your use was strictly within a philosophical context.
That's true. Yes. And it induces very interesting meditative states where you can experience the ultimate states. And once seeing that, I haven't continued it, by the way, because I've seen enough, but it is a vehicle for getting people to become aware that there is a greater ultimate reality accessible to them now. They don't have to go to extreme measures to experience it. If they risk it, it's a risk.
Well, you studied with many Buddhist and other Asian meditation teachers.
That's true.
I imagine some of them disapproved of psychedelics, and maybe they felt that it's sort of a bypass or a shortcut, and you may have some sort of mystical experience, but if you're not doing the work on yourself, you won't be able to integrate it.
Yes, I've heard that. You see, my breakthrough experience was not with LSD. It came through dreams. And actually, it was like yesterday, July 22nd, 1955. I had a full-blown enlightenment experience of divine luminosity. And from that experience, when I woke up, I saw that it was possible to set oneself in a similar state to experience it again. And so that became a part of me for a period. So therefore, when I then tested and took the LSD, I was able to get in the same state for a longer period of time and stay in that state and explore it. And that had a major change in my life because then I could understand the depth to it. It isn't just one experience, but it has a turning about process. We call it, the Greeks call it ousia, which is the experience turns about. It's a vivid dynamic of divine luminosity.
In other words, the mind looking at itself.
Ideal way to put it. That's very well said, and I appreciate it. Yes, that's exactly what it is.
And later on, when Leary and Alpert and Ralph Metzner wrote The Psychedelic Experience, they used the Tibetan Book of the Dead as their model for what it was like. Would you agree with that analogy?
Yes, interesting that I studied with Lama Tada, and that's one of the works we studied together, and that was in 1954, 1953, 1954. And again and again throughout the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it says, wake up to the pure light. the pure light is the divine luminosity.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it plays a central role throughout the entire, very fantastic work.
Yeah. So you seem to be suggesting then that the Tibetan lamas halfway around the world from Plato in ancient Greece were speaking of the same thing when they referred to this luminosity.
Yes, Evans Vance was the translator that we got into.
Uh-huh.
He did the 4 works on Tibetan philosophy. And all of them, including the great work on yoga.
The Yoga of the Great Liberation?
That's one of them, yes. And the other is Yoga and Secret Doctrines, yes.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, one on Milarepa. But that became their central part of their own philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, they even have a section on how important it is to know thyself. They were one of the great philosophers that expressed this idea, the central idea of philosophy is to know thyself.
Yes.
And that's different from other systems.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore there's a kinship between the Greek and the Tibetans on that very point.
Mm-hmm. Well, what were some of the experiences that you would share with Alan Watts when it came to psychedelics?
Well, later, I met Alan Watts. We were together at a party in New York City, and at that time, Alan was passing around LSD to certain people, and he said, "Here, Pierre, for you." And so that's one of the occasions I used LSD.
Mm-hmm.
Alan was a frequent user of it. As myself, I didn't. I had maybe half a dozen experiences with LSD, but I felt I've touched when I needed to touch.
Mm-hmm.
What is essential in my life, though, is I then went into Buddhism and studied Buddhism with various masters.
Yes.
And I reported this experience. Now, remember the dream state and the LSD state were the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I reported that to one of the Roshis, and he said, that's genuine.
Mm-hmm.
So I have it from a Roshi, a highly respected Roshi, that he accepted those experiences genuine, which is central and important. But then, several years later, I went beyond that, and that's the most important part, because that is the state where there is no divine luminosity, but pure seeing.
Pure seeing.
Pure seeing.
Not this radiance
No.
and this feeling of ecstasy,
That's
but
right.
something even beyond that.
Yes. Yes, I'm very fortunate. And you see, for years I thought that the divine luminosity was the highest state and was equivalent to the good or the one.
Which is, I gather from our earlier conversations, what you assume Plato was saying.
Yes. So I have in my own life matched the writings of Plato in that respect. And it's very interesting because I had thought the divine luminosity was the highest state, and I wrote a little book called Being in the One. And I took being to be divine luminosity, and I called that the one. Of course, subsequently, I grew out of that, but I held that view for quite a few years.
The one was a concept that we find in Plato, and
yes.
It struck me as that it's to some ways similar to what the ancient Vedantic philosophers would call Brahman.
Yes. Yes.
The one consciousness of the universe.
Yes. Yes. But I don't use the word consciousness. I prefer the idea of mind.
Mind, okay.
And because then you can ask, what is the source of mind? And then that gets you into what the higher idea of the one being the self.
Okay.
You
But at some point you went beyond that.
Yes.
Can you describe it? Is it describable?
Well, I landed there as a result of, I went into a week meditation, just stayed in meditation.
When you say week, you mean a week long?
Yes, yes. And so much to my surprise, I just got up from my sitting cushion and everything was just perfect. And everything was perfect, and I decided I didn't need to sit anymore. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize the significance of the state I was in for at least a year. But during that year, my world was turned upside down, because with quite ease I could describe people's faults, or the things they said didn't make any sense. I could spot it immediately and correct it. So I was really a bull in a china shop going around. And I was thinking everything is perfect, everything is fine and perfect. And that busted up my marriage, because I sat down one day and I said, good heavens, I made notes. And I said, look here, my dear, you just won 32 criticisms of me. She said, what? I said, yes, take a look. So I was going around doing that. Then I finally went back to a Roshi I was studying with. He said, oh my God. I said, next time, tell people the danger of this state.
Uh-huh. There's a phrase in Zen I've heard called the stink of enlightenment.
Oh, yes. The language, I heard the same expression that they call it the stench of enlightenment. It's more vivid.
Yeah.
But this doesn't necessarily have a stench to it, and that quality. That's most like the Christian, or people who are in moments of revelation, and they think they have the key to the universe. Mm-hmm. This is just obvious. Everything is just obvious. There's no point in broadcasting anything. Yeah. Just everything is perfect. Mm-hmm. Everything is the way it should be. Mm-hmm. But I assure you, it's a dangerous state to...
Well, yes, because you were, at the same time that everything was perfect, you had come up with 32 criticisms of your spouse.
Yeah. So that's part of the part where I got involved in philosophical midwifery. You see, philosophical midwifery is the art where you can help a person see the most fundamental problem, which they have no idea, nor do they suspect its presence. Mm-hmm. So I developed that work called philosophical midwifery.
You know, I did an interview with Houston Smith, a philosopher I presume you know, and who died last year. Yeah. And he studied a comparison of mystical experiences of the great mystics historically with psychedelic drug users and their descriptions. And he had these descriptions all written out, and then he brought in a bunch of scholars, and he said, can you sort these descriptions into two piles, one from the great mystics, one from the psychedelic drug users? And he found that they could not distinguish.
That's right.
The experiences themselves were identical, but if you look at the lives of these great mystics, they took that experience and they processed it and used it to live lives of great creativity and productiveness. They founded monasteries and communities. They helped build society, whereas that's not necessarily the case with the psychedelic drug users. In fact, it's probably rarely the case.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes, it doesn't have a transference because they have the recognition that it was brought about artificially, and that keeps them from exploring it genuinely. Because they have that sense of its artificial quality, and therefore they can't exhibit the qualities inherent in it. Mm-hmm.
So would you say that's probably true today, that psychedelics are really not a great tool for philosophy as it was once thought, or perhaps only for rare individuals? How would you evaluate it today?
Well, you see, in my case, I had the experience prior to LSD, so I didn't have that problem. But I would say that for certain people who have the need to experience more profound experiences, if they have the background and the solidity of their own character, it's a breakthrough experience, and it's worth risking it. But on the other hand, today we're living in a different world than the world I grew up with, because it was very rare in my youth to have anyone interested in these things, and that's not only psychedelics, of course, but it was very rare to have people talk about mysticism
at all. Yeah.
Or about Plato, or about any of these things. I went to a college, St. John's College, where they did the 100 Great Books.
Mm-hmm.
And after the first year, which was the classic period where they covered Plato, I would say in the second year, well, what happened to philosophy? As we went into European thought, kept saying, what happened to philosophy? You people, it's dead.
Something was lost after Plato.
Lost. That whole tradition. It's not just Plato. The whole Neoplatonic tradition is kept away from our culture, kept away from our schools.
The idea of know thyself as the primary dictum of philosophy got lost over time.
You know, that is so important, to know thyself, because that's the final experience. When the Greeks did the philosophy, especially Plato's and Plato's Republic, he said, hey, the beginning of the training of the philosopher king is he must hold fast to this question, what is the one self? And that echoes know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key concept behind all of this ancient philosophy. And, you know, I did an article called The Betrayal, and I pointed out that the idea of the self in ancient literature is simply not translated.
Mm-hmm.
They ignore it.
Yep.
And it's likely because, you see, in the spiritual life, if you have the idea of God, it's very easy to see it as something distinct from you, apart from you.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you have to need the idea of belief. But there's no need to believe in oneself. It would be absurd to think you have to believe in the self that you are. And therefore, there's no need for belief when you explore the idea of oneself, or know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea of no longer needed to believe in an exterior God independent of you disappears.
Because you have direct experience.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. If I can jump around a little bit, you mentioned something early on about peyote and how you could acquire a shoebox full of peyote buttons for $5, and that was before you ever experienced LSD.
That's true.
Can you compare the two?
Well, the word psychedelic experience, it was visionary, and therefore it had a content, a specific content.
Yes.
That visualizes all kinds of things. You have experiences of colors and magnificent patterns.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't present in the divine luminosity that can occur with LSD.
And peyote.
No, I've never known anyone who reached that state with peyote.
Oh, of divine luminosity.
That's right.
But in other words, you're distinguishing between divine luminosity and beautiful colors and patterns.
Yes, yes.
Because peyote was used as a sacred ritual amongst Native Americans.
Yes. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I participated within the American Indians taking peyote, so yes, more than once.
Mm-hmm. But you found that the American Indian approach didn't reach as far as the ancient Greek approach.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I lived it all, yes.
Okay. Now, let me jump around a bit again, because I know you're currently involved and have been going back a half a century working with addicts and alcoholics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know there's some work that's been reported in the literature about using LSD to help people break their addictions.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That is, they need to know there's something more profound and independent of their everyday world, and that changes their vision.
Mm-hmm.
The problem of addiction is that it masters you, and you have to live under the aspect of what you take, and that necessarily limits your vision and your capabilities of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
it chains the mind, and therefore you need something to break that chain.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
people
LSD
talk about cognitive impairments associated with addiction, typically denial.
Yes.
I'm not addicted. And,
I'm just loyal.
yeah. And so you've experienced that LSD and other psychedelics can help people break their addictions.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's going to play a major role when it's allowed.
Mm-hmm. So you can see that they're in a proper context with a therapist or in a philosophical situation or in a situation of a supportive spiritual environment. These substances can be very powerful and very positive.
Yes, without a doubt. Mm-hmm. And important for one's growth.
Yeah. Well, I can testify in my youth, I used a lot of psychedelics, quite a bit more than you did. And I have no regrets. I think it was an important part of my spiritual and personal evolution.
Oh, it offered me an opportunity to stay in what was a brief period in a dream, no intense and magnificent and all those qualities I can give it, but to be able to stay in it for maybe 20 minutes or so, it's a decisively different worldview.
And my sense is that even if you're not constantly maintaining that state, which it's hard to do if you're going to be driving your car and taking care of the necessities of life, but even the vivid memory of such a state helps elevate the mind throughout the vicissitudes of life.
Yes. You cannot take this. The everyday world as serious as you once did. Mm-hmm. There's a more. It really raises the crisis of why is it that we treat the everyday world with such intensity, and why do we engage ourselves in it with all of the presumed values we attach to it? Why are we hooked into that? Because there's really no need for that. It's better to look upon it as a used clothing store. You need this or that, and you just take it and pay for it. And you don't need to wrap it up. You don't need to dignify it with anything. But that's everyday world.
Well, of course, there are the immediate necessities for food and shelter and clean air and water and so on. But beyond that, it seems as if people get attached. Isn't that what so many spiritual traditions talk about, are these attachments?
And the most important part of their attachment is they don't realize how strong it is. And they're captured by it. And they need it in place. Like this itself is magnificent and beautiful. I've often admired it. But you don't have to be attached to it. You can appreciate the depth of it and the artistry of it. But that's different than seeing the world as the necessity of keeping your ego or your personality intact, and going to say that anything that infringes upon the loyalty of your own view of yourself is going to be a condition for violence or taking exception to it, that you shouldn't say this or that about the idea of the ego. In other words, loosened.
Yeah, people...
Yes.
People mistake spiritual evolution for the gratification of the ego.
Yes.
People struggle and struggle and struggle to feed their ego when what they really are attempting to do, unconsciously they maybe don't know it, is to satisfy this deeper need of the psyche for actualization.
Meaning. For meaning. That's what people really want. In relationships, in talks, they want meaning, but they don't know how to reach it.
Yeah.
And we have to help them understand how to reach it. But first, you can't reach for it unless you begin to see your own existence as meaning.
Yeah.
Once that dawns upon you, then you can relax and you can engage genuinely in this world.
Which is the basis of philosophy itself.
Right.
Well, Pierre Grimes, what a delightful discussion. Thank you so much.
Wait a minute, you mean it's over?
Well, I'm happy to say that we're going to have several more.
All right.
I'm looking forward to our ongoing conversations, and I will encourage our viewers to check our listings for additional new conversations with you.
Well, I'm enjoying it immensely. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you for being with us.